The film opens on a breathtaking tropical island, a place that seems like paradise. However, this beautiful setting is not just a vacation spot, it is where a select group of prisoners are sent to a unique and advanced facility known as Spiderhead. This facility is unlike any traditional prison you might imagine. Instead of being confined to small, cramped cells with little comfort, the prisoners here enjoy a much more pleasant living environment. Additionally, the prisoners are given time to engage in hobbies and activities that they enjoy, which allows them to explore their interests and passions. Each prisoner is equipped with a small device known as a MobiPack, which is attached to their backs. This device is crucial for the experiments as it contains the chemicals that will be administered to them. The experiments are overseen by a brilliant scientist named Steve Abnesti, who is deeply focused on his research and the outcomes of the tests he conducts. He is assisted by a colleague named Mark, who helps him manage the various aspects of the experiments. One of the first tests involves a prisoner named Ray, who is given a dose of a chemical called G46. As part of the experiment, Steve begins to tell Ray a series of silly jokes. To Steve's delight, Ray soon erupts into uncontrollable laughter, finding humor in even the most mundane situations. Even when Mark reads Ray some very sad and depressing historical facts, Ray continues to laugh heartily. Steve views this as a successful outcome and proudly adds a gold star sticker to his notes, indicating that the experiment has achieved its intended effect. The following day, another prisoner named Jeff is unexpectedly blindfolded and taken outside for a special experiment. After receiving a dose of a chemical called N40, the blindfold is removed, and Jeff is struck by the beauty of his surroundings. He struggles to articulate the overwhelming feelings of awe and wonder that wash over him. To help him express these emotions, he is given another chemical, B15, which assists him in finding the right words to describe the stunning view before him. Jeff speaks with a newfound eloquence and poetic flair, marveling at the breathtaking landscape, only to later realize that what he was actually looking at was a dirty and polluted environment, far from the idyllic scene he had imagined. After this eye-opening experience, Jeff heads to the kitchen, where he works alongside another prisoner named Lizzie. Jeff finds himself attracted to Lizzie, and their shared task of making snacks provides them with the perfect opportunity to connect and bond. As they work together, they exchange stories about the various experiments they have undergone, creating a sense of camaraderie between them. In his free time, Jeff enjoys retreating to his room, where he spends hours creating intricate designs on an Etch-a-Sketch. However, this solitude also brings back painful memories of the incident that led to his imprisonment. On a fateful night that changed his life forever, Jeff had attended a party with his best friend Adam and Adam's girlfriend Emma. After consuming too much alcohol, Jeff and Adam made the reckless decision to get into a car with Jeff behind the wheel. Tragically, Jeff lost control of the vehicle and crashed into a tree, resulting in Adam's death. For the next experiment, Jeff is paired with another prisoner named Heather. Before the test begins, Steve ensures that Jeff and Heather have never interacted before and asks them if they find each other attractive. Both respond with indifference, showing no interest in one another. However, after they are both given a dose of N40, something remarkable happens. They begin to perceive each other as incredibly beautiful, and the attraction between them becomes so intense that they cannot resist acting on their feelings, even in front of Steve, Mark, and the cameras recording the experiment. After their encounter, they lie together, whispering sweet words of love to each other. Steve and Mark celebrate the success of this experiment, but Steve decides to hold off on adding another gold star to his notes, wanting to observe if there are any lingering effects from the drug, such as withdrawal symptoms. Later, Jeff finds himself serving food in the facility and brings a meal to Heather. However, the atmosphere between them is awkward and strained. They do not speak, and there is no sign of the emotional connection they had felt during the experiment. Steve pushes forward with another test, this time pairing Jeff with Sarah, an older woman he does not find attractive at all. They administer a double dose of N40, and once again, Jeff finds himself unable to resist the chemical's powerful influence, succumbing to the feelings it induces. As Mark refills the chemicals in Jeff's MobiPack, he warns Jeff Jeff to be cautious during these encounters, as even a slight bump to the device could lead to a loss of control over his emotions. Seizing this opportunity, Jeff requests a new chore, secretly hoping it will help him avoid the uncomfortable situations that these tests often create. The next day, Jeff is brought to the observation area where Steve and Mark conduct their experiments. This time, there are two separate rooms. In one room, a man named Dave is continuously consuming large amounts of food, only pausing to vomit before eating more. In the other room, Jeff finds Heather and Sarah. Steve explains the nature of the test. Jeff must choose one of the women to receive a dose of a chemical called Darkenflox, which is designed to agitate the mind but cause no lasting harm. Jeff is deeply disturbed by this choice and adamantly refuses to make a selection. He explains that if he were forced to choose, he would simply pick one at random, as he does not have strong feelings for either woman. His refusal is partly rooted in a past experience with Darkenflox, which he remembers disliking intensely. Steve is intrigued by Jeff's response, noting that despite the emotional highs he has experienced under different chemicals, his final feelings always seem to revert to a neutral state. Later, Lizzie approaches Jeff, curious about his decision to change chores. Before they can engage in a meaningful conversation, the guards remind Jeff that today is his free day. This means he is allowed to leave the facility for a walk and make a phone call. As usual, when he attempts to call Emma, he is sent straight to voicemail. This time, he also mentions Lizzie, hinting at the connection he feels with her. In the following experiment, Jeff is paired with Rogan, a large and intimidating man with a rough demeanor. Fearing that they might force him into an intimate situation with Rogan, Jeff refuses to acknowledge any dose of the chemical. To his relief, nothing happens, and he and Rogan are allowed to leave the testing area. Driven by curiosity, Jeff rushes to the control room, where he confirms his suspicions. Heather had been asked to administer Darkenflox to either Jeff or Rogan, but she chose neither. It turns out she had also been involved with Rogan during previous tests. Furious about the manipulative nature of the experiments, Jeff confronts Steve, demanding to know if all the prisoners are being paired with one another for these tests. Steve shows him a chart that maps out all the connections between the prisoners. He explains that the experiments are part of a design mandated by the protocol committee, although he admits that he does not particularly like the idea either. When Jeff expresses discomfort with how far these tests are going, Steve reminds him that he volunteered for this program. The alternative is a life in a harsh state prison, filled with corrupt officers and a lack of basic comforts. Not wanting to lose the few privileges he has, Jeff reluctantly apologizes and agrees to participate in another test with Rogan, feeling relieved when Sarah chooses not to give either of them the Darkenflox. Later on, Steve, the scientist in charge of the experiments at Spiderhead, makes a bold decision. He decides to try a triple dose of the experimental chemicals on himself. To do this, he secretly uses his own MobiPack, the device that administers the chemicals. This is a risky move, as it could have unpredictable effects on him. Meanwhile, in another part of the facility, Jeff and Lizzie are sitting down together for dinner. They share a meal, and during their conversation, Jeff opens up about his past experiences with a chemical called Darkenflox. He explains just how terrible it made him feel during the times he was forced to take it. He admits that this place, Spiderhead, messes with his mind in ways he never expected. Sometimes he feels like he forgets who he was before he arrived at this facility. The following Monday, Steve decides to take an even bolder risk. He asks his assistant Mark to give him a triple dose of the experimental chemicals. Just as Jeff arrives for the day's experiment, he catches a glimpse of Steve and Mark in the middle of this unusual procedure. However, the scientists quickly hide everything from Jeff, ensuring that he does not comment on what he has seen. For the next trial, Steve informs Jeff that the committee has ordered them to resume testing the chemical known as Darkenflox. This means that Jeff has no choice but to administer the dose to Heather, another prisoner. As Steve is now affected by the chemicals, he becomes much more forceful in his approach. He pressures Jeff, reminding him that Heather is a prisoner because of terrible things she has done in her past. Steve also tells Jeff that he is lucky they chose him for this job instead of Rogan, another prisoner who is known for being aggressive. Despite Steve's pushing and insistence, Jeff stands firm in his refusal. He pleads with Steve to speak to the committee and asks them to reconsider their decision regarding the experiment. Steve leaves the room, pretending to call the committee to discuss the situation. Instead of making a real call, he heads to the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee and have a chat with Lizzie. After After some time passes, Steve returns to the testing room and lies to Jeff, saying that the committee refused to change their minds about the experiment. He warns Jeff that if he does not continue with the experiment, he will be kicked out of the program entirely. Feeling trapped and left with no other option, Jeff reluctantly agrees to give Heather the darkened flux. Almost immediately after Jeff administers the chemical, Heather starts to experience unbearable pain. Meanwhile, Mark gives Jeff another chemical called B15, which makes Jeff overly talkative and unable to control his words. Now Jeff finds himself in a position where he has to describe every terrifying detail of Heather's suffering. He expresses how it is making him feel incredibly guilty, and despite everything that is happening, he still does not love her. During her panic, Heather thrashes wildly, and in her struggle, she accidentally breaks the Mobipack that is attached to her. This causes the darkened flux to flood her system in an overwhelming dose. The effects of the chemical make Heather violent, to the point that she smashes a vase and uses the sharp broken pieces to take her own life before Mark can intervene. This shocking event sends Steve rushing out of the room to check on her, and in his haste, he drops his keys on the floor. As Steve and Mark argue over what just happened, Jeff sees an opportunity to sneak off and do some investigating of his own. Using Steve's keys, Jeff gains access to Steve's private notebook. Inside, he uncovers several shocking secrets that change everything he thought he knew. First, he finds a chemical formula labeled OBDX on a sheet of paper that has the logo of Abnesti Pharmaceuticals. Jeff also comes across a bingo card covered in gold stars, except for two numbers, 6 and 40. By lifting the stars, he realizes that these numbers represent all the chemicals they have been testing. The chemical N40, which hasn't been marked, corresponds to a chemical they haven't successfully tested for creating true love. Before Jeff can investigate further, he hears Steve returning and quickly puts everything back in its place. He throws the keys back onto the floor to avoid raising any suspicion about what he has just discovered. Later, Mark urges Steve to report what happened with Heather, but Steve refuses to do so. He argues that reporting the incident would lead to the shutdown of their entire operation, and he believes it is far too late to turn back now. After this tense conversation, Steve goes to check on Jeff, but not even his carefully rehearsed speech can ease the guilt that Jeff is feeling. So, Steve switches tactics and shares a story about the chemical they tested on a subject named Ray. This story sends both men into uncontrollable laughter, which Steve only interrupts by revealing a deeply personal story. His father abandoned him when he was a child. Curious about Steve's life, Jeff asks why Steve never leaves the facility, unlike Mark, who often takes breaks. Steve admits that this project is his one true passion, the love of his life, which keeps him bound to the facility. The next experiment involves Lizzie, who is given a chemical that induces extreme fear. After taking the chemical, she becomes terrified even by the sight of a simple stapler, which is a common office item. After the experiment, Lizzie shares her trauma and feelings of shame with Jeff. He can relate to her feelings, as his own sense of guilt is the reason he asked to change his duties in the facility. He shares the full story of the tragedy that haunts him. On that fateful night many months ago, Jeff's drunk driving didn't just kill his friend Adam, it also took the life of his girlfriend Emma. Since that tragic event, guilt has consumed him, and he struggles to cope with the weight of his actions. Lizzie offers Jeff comfort, and in a moment of connection, the two finally share a kiss, which signifies a deepening bond between them. Later, Steve finds them snacking together in the kitchen, and a plan starts to form in his mind. When he checks the security footage and sees Jeff drawing sketches of Lizzie, Steve feels assured that his plan is on the right track. Satisfied with his observations, he doses himself with N40 and heads to bed, feeling confident about the next steps in his experiments. The next day, Steve calls Jeff in for one final test. He must give Lizzie a dose of Darkenflux. To Jeff's surprise, he refuses to comply, and Steve allows him to leave without any immediate consequences. However, as soon as Jeff walks away, Steve instructs Mark to double Jeff's B6 dose. When Mark arrives at the testing room, Jeff confronts him, revealing that he knows there is no committee and that B6 is not a placebo. He realizes that it is the only chemical Steve truly cares about. Mark admits that he initially joined the project to work with a genius and change the world, but now he regrets his involvement in the experiments. Recognizing this change of heart, Jeff and Mark quickly form a plan before Mark Mark leaves for the weekend. The following Monday, it's just Steve and Jeff in the testing room, as Mark is supposedly sick at home. Jeff is given the control to dose Lizzie with Darkenflox, but once again, he refuses to go through with it. This infuriates Steve, who can't comprehend how Jeff and Lizzie could love each other after spending only a few months locked inside the facility. Desperate to manipulate Jeff, Steve tries to convince him by forcing Lizzie to reveal her crime. She accidentally left her baby in a hot car, and the child tragically died as a result. Lizzie breaks down in tears, pleading for Jeff to give her the chemicals that will alter her emotions. Reluctantly, Jeff presses the control screen, feeling torn between his love for Lizzie and the moral implications of what he is about to do. But instead of dosing Lizzie, Steve suddenly bursts into laughter. It turns out that Mark had faked being sick and reprogrammed the controls to dose Steve instead. He also added extra doses of B6 to Steve's Moby Pack. Now, Jeff takes his turn to put Steve through the fear-inducing chemical before finally giving him Darkenflox. As Steve writhes in pain from the effects of the chemicals, Jeff reveals that Mark is on his way with the police and that he has figured out the truth. B6 is a chemical designed to force compliance, making people do whatever the manipulator wants. The formula known as OBDX stands for OBDX, which is a clever play on the word obedience. This name suggests that the chemical is intended to create a sense of compliance or submission among the people who are affected by it. Even in the midst of his own intense pain and suffering, Steve passionately argues that the chemical BX could still be used for good purposes in the future. However, he admits that its testing is not yet complete because it hasn't achieved what he refers to as total obedience. The chemical, despite its intended effects, has not been able to overpower the deepest emotions that exist within its subjects. In a shocking revelation, Steve also confesses that both Jeff and Lizzie had actually completed their sentences several days ago. However, he chose not to inform them about this important piece of information. Jeff, feeling a rush of anger at this betrayal, reacts violently. He slams Steve's head onto the table, using this forceful action to compel Steve to use his fingerprint to unlock the facility's front door. With the door now open, Jeff sees an opportunity for freedom. He is determined to escape from the facility. As Jeff prepares to leave, he notices Steve reaching for a knife that could be dangerous. Alarmed by this, Jeff orders Steve to drop the knife immediately. Steve had previously stated that this project and the work he is doing are his true love, and he is willing to protect it at any cost. In a moment of desperation, Steve strikes Jeff and seizes control of the situation. He quickly administers 4 doses of Darkenflox to Lizzie, which instantly drives her into a state of madness. In the midst of chaos, Jeff and Steve engage in a struggle. Jeff fights back with great determination, and in the heat of the moment, he manages to break both the control device and Steve's Moby Pack. The sudden surge of chemicals released from the damaged devices weakens Steve, allowing Jeff to knock him down to the ground. Seizing the moment, Jeff grabs the keys that Steve had dropped earlier. He rushes over to Lizzie, who is in distress, and manages to help her calm down. With the keys in hand, he unlocks her Moby Pack, effectively removing all the chemicals that were affecting her. Feeling relieved, Lizzie apologizes to Jeff for not confessing her crime sooner. Determined to escape the facility together, the two prepare themselves to leave. Meanwhile, Steve makes an announcement over the intercom system, urgently urging the other prisoners to stop Jeff and Lizzie if they do not want to lose their privileges. Realizing that the police are approaching, as seen on the security cameras, Steve grabs as many vials of chemicals as he can carry and prepares to flee the scene. As Jeff and Lizzie make their escape, they encounter several prisoners who are determined to stop them, including Sarah and Ray. The situation becomes tense, and they must fight off these individuals to gain their freedom. Dave, another prisoner, also tries to intervene, but Lizzie cleverly distracts him by tossing him the keys to the pantry. This unexpected action buys them some time. With the rest of the prisoners chasing after them, Jeff and Lizzie sprint toward the final hallway of the facility. By the time Jeff and Lizzie make it outside, they see that Steve is already taking off in his private plane, attempting to escape the chaos. Not wasting any time, Jeff and Lizzie hop into a motorboat, ready to race away from the facility and the turmoil they have just experienced. Mark, who is with the police in their boats nearby, watches in disbelief as Steve's plane takes off into the sky. However, Steve's mind is clouded by the effects of N40, causing him to see a beautiful horizon ahead instead of the looming mountain that is directly in his path. His impaired vision leads to a tragic outcome as his plane crashes into the mountain and explodes, creating a massive fireball in the sky. Jeff and Lizzie witness this shocking event, their eyes wide with disbelief at the fiery end of Steve's escape attempt. As they watch the destruction unfold before them, Jeff comes to a profound realization: there is no chemical that can bring about self-forgiveness. This is an important truth that he understands deeply. Self-forgiveness is not something that can be achieved through external means or substances. It is something that every individual must find within themselves. This moment of clarity emphasizes the importance of personal responsibility and the need for individuals to confront their own mistakes and emotions to heal the end. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.